This is a 1953 Ariel Square Four, and it has one of the weirdest motors ever put in a motorcycle.
If you just take a quick look at the Ariel here, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's some modern cafe racer neo-retro remake with a Springer seat and a weirdly fat parallel twin. But you'd be very wrong. Running examples of these bikes are so rare that outside of a museum or Jay Leno's garage, you'll probably never see one of these in person, and you'll certainly never get to ride one. But this bike is an absolute legend, and it has caused ripple effects throughout the entire motorcycle industry that we can still feel to this day. So let's start out with a little bit of background. For those of you who are really only acquainted with modern motorcycles, and here by modern I'm gonna include everything going back to the CB750, so yeah, basically the last 50 years, the early days of motorcycling were chaotic to say the least. If you hop on a modern bike, you know where everything is. The clutch lives on the left handlebar, the throttle and the front brake are on the right, then you've got a rear foot brake on the right and your shifter on the left. We also realized as a species that forks are better than Springer front ends and that disc brakes are better for stopping than the Flintstones method. Back in the day though, we hadn't learned any of those lessons yet. In the 20s, you saw Indian drop their Scout with the throttle placed on the left handlebar, a right-hand shifter by your knee, and well, I could go on here. If we could do things wrong, by God, we did it wrong. Early bikes were also so plagued by reliability issues that you might not make it home. By the 30s, we wisened up a little bit and started standardizing the layout on these motorcycles. Throttles were on the right, toe shifters started showing up, brake levers were in the right spots too. This was the era of the Triumph Speed Twin, the Royal Enfield Bullet, and if you ask me, the last time England produced a good motorcycle. Jokes aside, it was the heyday of British motorcycling. BSA, Brough Superior, Triumph, Royal Enfield, Vincent, and Ariel ran the show, with Harley Davidson and Indian bogged down by a minor economic hiccup in the United States. But hey, what's a mere 607% bump in the unemployment rate and 24% overall in the grand scheme of things, right? I mean, what's it at now? 10? 12? 4? Really? Okay. Anyway, Ariel got their start back in 1902 in Bournebrook, Birmingham, after a 32-year run of building penny farthing bikes. You know, the one with the goofy giant wheel that looks like a custom road glide. They made a few 2 and 4 horsepower motorcycles, but they didn't find any real success until 1931 when Edward Turner, remember that name, designed the Square Four, and then the next year the Ariel Red Hunter. The first Square Four was a 500cc Square Four motor, meaning that if you took the head off, you'd see all pistons sat 2x2. Numbers are unreliable for this bike, since in 1932 they bumped the cc's to 601. That bike put down 23 horsepower and weighed in roughly 400 pounds, so, you know, like a modern Royal Enfield. It might not sound like a lot, but in the Mods Trophy Test, an independent endurance test award for motorcycles, the Squariel did 700 miles in 700 minutes. The bike went through several improvements, like a bump to 995 cc's to help alleviate some overheating issues experienced in the rear cylinders in 1937. In 1949, the Mark I managed to cut 30 pounds by switching from a cast iron head to an alloy one. Man, have we come a long way. And then the Mark II, which we're looking at today, featured a 2-into-2 exhaust with each cylinder getting its own exhaust pipe. That bike had plunger suspension, an SU carburetor, and 2 drum brakes, which were marginally better than the Flintstones method, and this thing could hit 100 miles per hour if you weren't particularly attached to your flesh vessel. This bike put down 45 horsepower while weighing in at 425 pounds, so like a modern Royal Enfield, and that's not a joke this time. Production ceased in 1959, but the Square Four and the Red Hunter were so successful that Ariel could buy a little company by the name of Triumph, and Ed Turner could design the Speed Twin, a bike so irrelevant to the history of motorcycling as a whole that we never heard about it again. Oh wait, never mind. That's why we have the entire Bonneville line right now. So if you're mad about hipsters in flannel shirts with manicured beards spilling out the bottom of their Built-Well Gringo helmet, turning Bonnies into cafe racers, blame Ed and blame the Square Four. But that's enough from me. Let's hear from a mechanic who's actually worked on one of these things and see what makes it so wild.
Hey, I am Elijah with Limey Bikes. I'm one of the owners here. We are a small local bike shop in Austin that specializes in mostly vintage Japanese, but we also work on the really, really old British stuff. This was just a really weird machine. It was called the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles at the time. And there's a couple reasons for that. So everything was really, really well made by 20 standards. This is a 53, but they didn't really change much. So like with the engine, the reason it's called a Square Four is it's 4 pistons that go up and down in a brick. It's basically 2 500 parallel twin Triumph motors that are sandwiched into one big cube. And that led to some like really weird design choices. Some of the cool stuff about it that is sort of typical for the time for English bikes is you've got an ammeter on the headlight, which basically shows you if the bike's on. And you'll notice the ammeter runs toward the negative because these were wired by Lucas, so positive ground, which is actually the way electricity works, but is not the way anything else is wired outside of computer chips. The other thing that's really cool that was also pretty standard is the Smith's chronometric clocks, which basically means that the speedo functions sort of like a pocket watch. And as you go down the road, it'll actually sit there and tick, which is kind of just a really trippy thing to watch and like just cool to get used to. If you take them apart, they're beautiful and really, really intricate and incredibly hard to put back together. So the stuff that's gonna throw you for a loop is first off the brakes. English brakes are, sorry England, fucking terrible. They're half-width drums, they're vague. The rears are spongy to the point that you feel resistance, but you're not sure anything's happening. And the front actually has decent feedback for a drum, but because it's so small, the amount of force required to stop the bike is pretty Herculean. The other thing that's gonna feel weird is just from a suspension standpoint, is a mechanical steering dampener. They don't really work. It's basically just a big screw. So if you start messing with that, you're gonna have trouble turning, and that's just something not to touch, but an interesting feature. The other thing that's really trippy about the way these are set up is they have a plunger rear end, which means if you're looking at it from the back, it's kind of like 2 shocks, but there's no swing arm. They're independently supported, so the tire can actually cant back and forth as you're going down the road. So that combined with the Springer seat tends to lead to a sort of vague experience in relation to, you know, what's the wheel doing on the pavement, which is something as a motorcyclist is kind of unnerving. And the rear brake's on the left and the shifter's on the right. And it's on this bike, it's set up in a GP style shift, so it's 1 up and 3 down. And another thing about the 20s is they hadn't quite figured out transmissions. So while you're riding, you can basically find neutral wherever you want. It's sort of pick your own neutral. There's supposed to be one between first and second. There's definitely one between third and fourth on this one. Second to third, second to third's pretty tight. The carburetor's weird. It's an Amel side draft that nothing else ever took. All the bodywork, they only made a couple thousand of these a year at most. There isn't anything for this machine that you can buy. So if anything ever breaks, you know, you have to beg, borrow, steal, or quite often machine your own parts, or just spend an absolute fortune. And they're expensive to start with. Like a crappy one of these is anywhere from really $10,000 to $15,000. A nice one's 20 to 40, depending on year, make, and model. This bike is probably somewhere in the 20s. Just looking on Bring a Trailer, you know, you find a decent Square Four. It's not original, but it's mostly original. It's been nicely redone. It's period correct, like the chrome's in really good shape on the tank. In a decade of this shop and about 7,000 motorcycles, this is the 3rd one we've ever had. And that's specializing in vintage Japanese and British stuff. So one of them we had actually came from Utah. So there just isn't anyone that works on them. They really aren't here. They're kind of not a thing. So with all that said, I still really want one. I don't know why. It's a bad decision. They're not built for Texas. Like 4 cylinders and a brick is a horrible idea in a state that routinely experiences triple-digit temperatures. But I don't know, man. Like, if you ever get a chance to ride one, it's a really, really neat, weird experience. Just remember the shifter and the brake being reversed and upside down is a bit of a trip. But other than that, yeah, no, that's pretty much everything. Today we're starting up a 1953 Ariel Square Four, which is kind of a weird procedure. So you've got your fuel valves, your regular and reserve, which are actually pull valves instead of like what we're used to, like a more traditional ball valve setup or a plate. And the same thing is true for the choke. This looks a little bit more, this pretty little brass handle is actually your choke for startup. And then that's pretty much it. We just go to the key. The cool thing about it is when you turn the key on, the way you know it's on is your amp meter will drop slightly. So that shows if the ignition is working. So you can see it's not much. Off, on, right? And if we turn the lights on, we turn on the headlight, it'll drop a whole bunch more. So it's just a little indicator, but that way you know your key's in the right position before you start kicking it. And then just wind up and kick.